name is Chris Wren. I'm the chair of the XCS Advisory Committee. And if you were fortunate enough to catch the earlier panel on global production support, you would have heard the important yet difficult role certification plays in delivering quality to players in a world of constant updates and games as a service. We are extremely privileged to have Peter Cardwell, head of Xbox certification for Microsoft, I should say, and 20-year games veteran, here to discuss Trust and Verify, to bringing the best possible games and experiences to players. So please join me in welcoming Peter Cardwell.
Hi. Let's talk about something that scares a lot of people, shall we? That's the world of certification. Good certification is obvious. Great certification is transparent. And that was a quote that came from Joe Sperano. And Joe used it in the context of design. And when I read that quote, I realized it was equally as applicable in the world of certification, the world that I live in. But for me, the meaning of transparent really is about where we're headed with games as a service. Because for years, lots of platform holders have had good certification. Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, Apple, over the years, they've all had really good certification processes. I remember back on the original Xbox platform, the certification timeline used to take 21 days to release a product. Over the years, that timeline has reduced from 21 days down to 14, down to 10, 7, and now even as low as 5 days. And that's good, as I said, good certification models, but they're not good enough. In today's world of games as a service and connected environments, that certification process has to be transparent. And when I use that word, I mean it has to be seamless to developers. It has to happen within hours or even less. So today, we're going to talk about three things: why that's important, what it is about certification that needs to change, and more importantly, and the really important thing for the people in this room, is how you get engaged to help publishers achieve that. If you look to the future and you see the present, you're wrong. You're so wrong. Because today's processes are too costly. They're too time-consuming, and they add too much friction into the pipeline. The processes that are needed for tomorrow really need to start embracing some of the changes that we've spoken about throughout the whole of the day. As an example, I'm going to use something which should be very familiar to everybody. This is a copy of the very latest, ironically, the very latest version of Recore. It's the definitive version. It's, in actual fact, the Xbox One X version, so it's full of the 4K assets, okay? And it's the usual format that the industry has known for years to ship a product. It's a shiny disc that sits inside a plastic box. It's wrapped in cellophane, and it sits on the shelf at Walmart or wherever else you want to go and buy it. And it's been the model that the industry's used for years to ship products. The point I'm making here is that just in the last few years, that model has changed. And to reinforce the point, I'm going to give this copy away to somebody. Because I'll ask the audience the question. So this is audience participation time. What percentage of products today on the live service do you think ship via physical media alone? Anybody hazard a guess? 5%? Any more? 0? Who said 0? It's pretty close. 2%. I'm probably going to give it to the guy who said 1%, because the actual answer is 0.6%. Less than 1% of titles that ship today ship on physical media only. Around 12% choose to ship on physical media and in digital space. and a massive 87% choose to ship digital only. That's huge. And so you can see the transformation that needs to take place to support that. And that doesn't end with developers. It ends with the platform holders as well. So why has the certification process been so time-consuming? Why has it been so long? Why has it this stigma of being so scary? Well, it's funny, I got into the conversation around this earlier, just after lunch. And to understand some of that, you have to go back in time. You have to look at the history of platform development. And it's quite funny because back then, there was this game that publishers and platform holders used to play with each other, of trying to get something through to the platform without them finding it. You know, implicitly in the concept of publishers wanting the best possible content on those platforms, there was this ownership of quality. And we spoke about this in the panel earlier on today. Once you own that quality and you put yourself in the responsibility of being an owner of that quality, you start to be responsible for testing for it. And it's really a crazy world that grows out of that, because you take on that ownership and responsibility for quality, and you play this round-robin game of totally convincing yourself that the more test resources you put onto a product, the more test resources you need for that product. Add to that the complexity of titles that came along, and they were hugely complex. And our environments just weren't up to it. Trying to replicate development environments where titles had been built with all the associated back-end services, trying to replicate that in a safe and secure manner in order to test it, and then further trying to replicate that in production was hugely complex, hugely time-consuming, and fraught with problems at every stage of the way, because 9 times out of 10, those processes and those configurations had to be changed manually, and so they were fraught with error. This created this world, as I said, this crazy world that we lived in, where we had this revolving door of publishers throwing content at platform holders and hoping it would pass, not knowing what was happening. And it created this world in which we lived in, which was completely crazy. So we've understood why certification was such a problem. Now we have to look at what has to change in order for that to not be a problem. Certification is a single point test. It's the test that comes right at the end of the development process before the product ships. And that's fine, except the biggest problem with it is it's only as good as the time in which you did the test. 5 minutes after, an hour after, the results of that test are completely invalid. And as I mentioned, in today's world, where the consumer's demands are always changing, and the success of that product with the publishers is about answering that requirement to change, very quickly, certification actually becomes a hindrance and stops publishers building great games. So you've created this process that was out there originally to be the shepherd of quality, and it's actually now preventing publishers from delivering quality. This was also discussed in the session previously that I was in the panel. And it really was a pivotal moment for us at Microsoft, where we started to think about this problem and who really owns quality at this process. And we very quickly realized that as a platform holder, we don't own the quality of that product. The people that own the quality of that product are the publishers themselves, the content creators. And my job at Microsoft is literally to mitigate the risk to Xbox, the brand, and the live service. And we really cut our teeth on this in 2 titles. The first one being Project Spark. For those of you who don't know, Project Spark was a game, it was a first-party title, it was a Microsoft game, and it was this real world. Gamers could come into this environment, they could build worlds on their own, they could build worlds that other people had built, and they could interact within these worlds. And it was so powerful as a title that it was actually used to create a rock video for Linkin Park's Guilty All the Same. So if you haven't seen it and you're a Linkin Park fan, go to YouTube and have a look at that. But it really was such a powerful game. Project Spark first came through Microsoft Cert in February 2014. And we turned the servers off on that title in September 2016. So in that 2.5-year period that the game lived, it went through over 50 updates. Now that's about once a month that it updated. Really was, for me and my team, the first time that we got to play with and understand what it meant to have a games as a service. Fast forward to today, and the latest title in the Microsoft catalog that runs like this is Sea of Thieves. For those of you who don't know and you haven't played Sea of Thieves is an awesome game. I would absolutely recommend it to everybody. You get to play the role of a pirate, and who doesn't like being a pirate? So you get to play the role of a pirate, you join a crew with other pirates, and you get to storm the seas, rob loot, drink grog, get drunk, fall out of the crow's nest, all the sort of things that you enjoy doing as a pirate. The interesting thing about Sea of Thieves, though, is that it hasn't even shipped yet. It's a title which isn't going to ship until next year. And yet already, that title has done over 100 updates to the service. It's updating today weekly. That is true games as a service. Now, hang on. It's updating weekly. Pete, you said a minute ago that certification processes take 5 days. Do the math here, I'm confused. How can it do that? You're right, it can't. Titles today that need to do that can't go through a lethargic certification process. In fact, I have 2 copies of Recall, and I'm going to give another one away today. Another pop quiz. Of the titles today on the live service, can anybody hazard a guess as to what the average number of content updates is? 10? No. 20? 40? I've been a little bit cheeky with that question, because the number will probably surprise you. The number is only 2.8. 2.8. Now that didn't pass the gut check with me. When I looked at those numbers and I looked at the statistics, I'm like, 2.8, that doesn't feel about right. It's because the numbers are offset. The reason that number is so low as an average is because in the catalog, there's a wealth of indie titles. There's a wealth of small titles that don't update. And so they're skewing the numbers somewhat. And so although I've mentioned titles like Sea of Thieves and Project Spark that do 50, 60, 70 updates, those ones aren't really represented in that number. What is important, however, is when you look at the rate of growth. That number of 2.8, or almost 3 updates today on a title, that's the number as of today. 18 months ago, that number was 2.4. 18 months prior to that, that number was 1.9. So you can very quickly see, in a very short space of time, the rate of growth associated with all of these titles. And that speaks to the necessity that publishers have today to keep their titles alive longer and answer the demands of the consumer in that space. We've now understood why certification was so painful and how it needs to change. We've now gone through how it needs to change. And because the doors are closed and we're all friends in here, the next part is super, super important. It's the how, okay? And because we're not going to go and tell Sony about this, okay, I'm going to give you the secret to certification that's so simple, even your bosses will understand it. And it starts with this. This model is extremely simple. As I said, it has to be simple because even my boss understands it. And it consists of just 3 elements. This first element, really this first element is the key to it. It's the key to solving that problem of not knowing what you're dealing with. In this element, we take away that old model of publishers throwing content at certification, at the platform holders, where you didn't know what you were dealing with. You had no idea what was coming your way. And in this model, you start to suddenly gain an insight into what's coming your way. You start to gain an insight into what's the risk associated with this submission. You start to look at indicators. And again, the session that I spoke to earlier spoke about telemetry within titles and understanding data associated with titles. And so you can very quickly start to build up a picture of the risk associated with the game that you're dealing with. For example, if you know how many hours a title has run, and you know what the crash rate was for that duration of time, you can quickly start to calculate what the mean time to failure is. If you know that a game has launched all of the achievements and they've launched in the right order, you can quickly start to attain that the services supplying those achievements are running well. If you know that the multiplayer game sessions have been hosted and that gamers are playing through those sessions, you know that those services are built to support multiplayer game sessions. The point I'm making here is that very quickly you can start to understand what it is that you're dealing with. And once you understand what it is that you're dealing with, you can then make risk assessments. You can then move on to the second part, which is the adaptive certification. If for one moment you realize that that whole green sector at the bottom there, imagine in your mind that that whole section is the full plethora of certification tests. That's the 120-something tests that my team run today on a title. That's what you would have to run if you didn't know what you were dealing with. Because in the world where you don't know what you're dealing with, you have to assume the worst. And if you assume the worst, it means you have to test everything. In this new model, once I know what I'm dealing with, I can take risk associated with what I know about that title and the performance of it in the world. And so I can start to trust. And where I don't have visibility into that, I can start to verify. And so very quickly, we can start to do very pinpointed, very focused certification tests that are no longer taking 5 days. The final component of this model is the really important one, because it's the check and the balance. And the way that I explain this to people is I've related to something that we all understand. I relate it to the tax man. Not dissimilar to myself. It is, in fact, very similar to something everybody understands, filing a tax return. Every year, we all file a tax return. We all either get a check or we send a check. And at the end of the year, the IRS has the ability to pull your file and to do an audit. And it's that audit, it's that check and balance that keeps people honest. And in this model, it's that check and balance in the production environment that allows us to test the full suite of tests, that allows us to keep ourselves honest. Now, each component of that model has to be there. Each component of that model feeds into the other. The predictive modeling that we do, the understanding of what we're dealing with feeds into the decisions that we make in our adaptive certification process and really helps us determine the level of risk associated with that game. That, in turn, feeds into the life cycle assessment and whether we do an audit or not, or how often we do an audit, how often is the game updating. And that, in turn, feeds again into the predictive modeling. So it really is a model that is super, super simple, but very, very powerful. And I'm glad to say that it works. It takes the certification process that used to take 5 days down to 8 hours, or even less. In many instances, titles that we're shipping today don't need to be certified at all because there is no risk with them. As I said, with titles like Sea of Thieves, I'm not going to test that anymore. When that title ships, it will simply be the flick of a switch. Then certification truly becomes transparent. So, what part do you all play in this? What part is important for you to help publishers help me in this vision? Well, first and foremost, it's to go the extra mile. Publishers today are building on shifting sands. They have the complexity to deal with everything from changing operating systems to dependencies on partner software, dependencies on middleware, network changes, infrastructure changes, all of these factors which have no control over on their titles. The actual sands that they're building on are shifting underneath them. That's where companies like you really have a part to play in helping developers in this, because it's a super complex landscape, and they can't do it on their own. It will differentiate you. Second part is to share in this mindset. I've introduced you to a philosophy that I have at Microsoft and at Xbox that really said we can't test quality in. The days of trying to test quality in don't work anymore. As I said in a previous session, in the original Xbox days, it was not uncommon to see a title come through 7, 8, 9, or even 10 times. In today's world, that's untenable. You can't do that. So it really is the mindset that needs to change with publishers. Again, you can help change that vision and that mindset. And finally, use your skills. Use the skills and assets that you have in your resources. I spoke to the model earlier on, and that diagram that I had, in that first quadrant where we looked at building predictive engines, I had a normal team. I had a team of developers, I had a team of engineers, I had a team of software test engineers. I didn't have skills in data science. I didn't have data engineers in my team. Yet we had 7 years worth of data, 7 years worth of every single product that shipped on the Xbox platform. And I knew the nugget, the gem of information that I wanted lay within that 7 years worth of data. I needed to acquire those skills. The quickest way for me to acquire those skills was through outsourced companies. They had the skills. They had the data scientists. They had the data engineers that I needed. And they were able to quickly solve that problem for me. The other component I spoke about towards the end, the audit process. There are multiple data points that feed into that to allow us to look and monitor at how a title is performing in production. Again, I called upon the outsourced data engineers and vendors to help me solve that problem. One of the things we needed to be able to do was understand sentiment and player sentiment and be able to very quickly see what comments were coming in on forums, on Reddit, on Twitter, and be able to respond to those. And so that ability, again, to use that data in a smart way to help us build learning engines that would trigger an indicator to us, to a title's health and a title problem. So again, the 3 key points there: go the extra mile. It will really help differentiate you with publishers. Share this evolutionary mindset. Get away from that old mindset of being able to test quality in because it doesn't work anymore. And finally, use your strengths. Use the experience that you have. If you were in my earlier session, you'd have heard that a lot of the skills that we're now using today in the games industry came from the medical industry, believe it or not. That was unheard of. So, with that, I'm not going to kill you with PowerPoint. Thank you. My name is Peter Cardwell, and you can contact me at peter@xbox.com. Thank you very much. You've been awesome. Peace.